We married in June, honeymooned in Puerto Rico for a week, and then spent the rest of the summer idling in a little house on the lake in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I puttered at reading British history and economics, but mostly we water skied, fished, watched TV, and generally loafed. Friends came by to visit. The water was warm. We idly drifted around the dock on floats, reading paperbacks each afternoon. Every day seemed to laze by, the sun slowly dropping, the shadows growing across the lawn down to the dock, while we cuddled and cooed on the porch. There was absolutely nothing wrong, and nothing to worry about. Not about parents, children, house, exams, money, or profession. Nothing. It was just us. And our spell was broken only when my parents and grandmother came by on weekends. But that summer we cared for no one and no thing in the outside world. That time was really all about nothing more than the two of us being together, in love, as the long days went by. Then, like everything else in life, those 6 idyllic weeks were gone. When we got back to Europe, we bought a new car, a cute, practical, even less expensive Opel Kadett. We picked it up at the factory in Germany, then took it on a quick trip to visit friends in Switzerland. And from there it was back to England on the ferry, then a very cautious trip up the M2 highway. When we finally got to Oxford, we moved into a little house I'd rented there. It was my second year, same routine with the tutorials and sports, but now Gert was alongside me. That autumn we were visited by Major Powell Hutton, a West Point graduate from the class of 1959. He was one of 5 Rhodes Scholars the Military Academy had produced that year, and he'd returned briefly to Oxford to help dedicate a music room at one of the colleges to Jim Ray, his best friend and a fellow West Point Rhodes Scholar, recently killed in Vietnam. Powell took us to a nice restaurant near Oxford, and over roast beef and Yorkshire pudding we talked about Oxford, West Point, the Army, and Vietnam. He'd already served there himself, and Jim Ray had died there. He was reflective and nostalgic, but it was also very much the mentor. As he looked over at Gert and me, he paused for a moment, then smiled at us. "You know, you two are starting life with the dessert course." That was something we'd already begun to suspect. There was leisure time and freedom, restaurants and plays in Oxford, travel on the continent, and for all its reputation, study at Oxford wasn't too difficult, not after West Point. At least it wasn't too difficult academically. But it was terribly difficult emotionally. Each week we'd scan the casualty lists printed in the Army Times newspaper, and too often find the names of classmates and friends. And at the same time, the Oxford environment was strongly anti-war and increasingly anti-American. Even my fellow Rhodes Scholars had turned against our policy in Vietnam and against our soldiers who were carrying it out. But there were a few of us who stuck together and maintained our conviction that opposing the expansion of communism was right and necessary. We also maintained our belief that somehow the Vietnam effort could be made to work out. Even so, I tried to keep friendships as best I could across the growing intellectual and emotional divide. It was a little like what I'd already experienced over racial issues while growing up in Little Rock. Good people could profoundly disagree, and sincerity was no assurance of being right. I carried the dialogue a step further as a participant in the American Embassy's speaker program. I was invited to speak at foreign policy debates across Britain. It was an interesting way to see the country, but not always without conflict. In November 1967, Gert and I drove the little blue Opel to Hull, on England's eastern coast, for a teach-in sponsored by the Quakers. I was paired with an assistant from South Vietnam's embassy and spoke against the local member of parliament, a communist labor leader, a Pakistani Oxford-educated student leader, an American draft dodger, and several university faculty members. It was one of those gloomy early winter days in England. The cold air damp and heavy with the sweet smell of burning coal, a thick cover of clouds, the streets slick with moisture, people's cheeks bright with the chill. We began the teach-in at around 2, with my wife Gert seated alone in the front row, some 400 bundled-up spectators packed in behind, and a few bobbies standing in the back. As the Quaker chairman moved to the podium, a group of Maoists began chanting, "Bobbies out! Bobbies out!" After a few minutes' delay, the police quietly filed out the door. The chairman indicated then firmly that he was against the war too, and against the Americans, and he encouraged the audience to make their views known too. I could see Gert shiver a little in the front row, but I knew I at least had one strong supporter. The opposition began with the local Labor MP making a rousing 15-minute attack on America and South Vietnam. The audience applauded vigorously. I took the podium in rebuttal to a respectful smattering of applause. The South Vietnamese official spoke briefly, admitted his wife thought he was crazy to defend his government's policies, and then announced he was leaving early, so I'd be left on my own to rebut the next 5 speakers. Interestingly, one of the key issues concerned the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. The government's opponents triumphantly quoted an alleged 1955 statement from then-President Eisenhower that North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh would probably win any election were it held. But whether this was true or not, I countered, it was irrelevant. The country had been legally divided, and the South had its own president and elected leaders. There was no legal basis to justify the North's invasion. Still, it was a signal warning. If your policy takes you against the most powerful and popular leaders of a country, even a divided country, maybe you ought to be looking at who you're aligned with and why, or at least find another place to make a stand. The program continued without pause until almost 8 p.m., when we finally adjourned. I'd spoken 5 or 6 times and been treated with respect by the audience, though it was clear they weren't agreeing with me. The Communist Party leader of Northeast England graciously invited us over to his house for a light dinner, and we accepted, as we were expected to do. A few minutes later, we were in the party leader's comfortable home. As the novelty guest, we were fawned over and proselytized by our host. Seated in front of a cheery coal fireplace, he was explaining to Gert how women were treated much better under communism. I was relaxed, enjoying the repartee and a pint of bitters, when I heard a commotion behind me. "I'm going to kill you," someone hissed. I looked around. Was this some kind of a joke? There was a ruddy-faced fellow leaning in my direction, grimacing with threat towards me. "You're killing my comrades in Vietnam, and I'm going to kill you." I could see this was no joke, at least not for him. All conversation suddenly stopped. I saw his naked hostility. I felt my ears start to burn as I rose to my feet. There was a sofa between us, and I was judging angles and distances when the host also stood up and gave an order. "Get him out of here. Lieutenant Clark is our guest." But the evening was over. We left shortly thereafter, departing with a British couple who had volunteered to put us up for the night. But once we got back to their home, they showed very little sympathy. "Well, you must understand," they said, "people over here are very angry." Sure, I thought, but I won't accept this. We left early the next morning to drive back to Oxford, and I was more determined than ever to stand up for what I believed. Our troops in Vietnam were doing their duty. They were fighting against cross-border aggression, aided and abetted by the Soviet Union and China. Standing up against that aggression was an American obligation, and this is where we determined to make the stand. I respected our Army, its soldiers, and its leaders. They were as noble and high-minded a group of American warriors as had ever stood in harm's way. They weren't in it for spoils or adventure. It was a cause, the cause of protecting America and securing our freedoms. They were my classmates and faculty from West Point. They were good men, and they and our cause should be respected, not attacked. I talked about the experience with my friend Alex Hautel one night. We agreed that what was worth living for was worth fighting for and dying for. We would fight in Vietnam, and yes, there were personal risks, but we would accept them. One day the next summer, a few weeks before we were due to leave Oxford for good, Gert told me that I'd gotten a phone call from someone named Molly Friedman, a woman who claimed to be my cousin. Then she asked me if I'd ever heard of any Jewish roots in my family. I was completely surprised by this, but I didn't really know much about my biological father's background, so I told her it might be possible. Then I returned Molly's call. We soon met Molly and her husband Lester, and I learned about my father's side of the family. My father, Benjamin Caney, was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. Just before the turn of the century, his father, Jacob, had immigrated from Minsk, along with his brother, his fiancée, and her little sister, and had settled in Chicago. There were 3 brothers. They had 19 children of that generation. My father was the oldest. A week later, another cousin called, and we had dinner with him and his family, too. He was my first cousin, Dick Cardozo, who hadn't seen me since I was 4 years old, and he filled in more of the story. Both families were passing through London on the way home from visits to Jerusalem, which had been captured by the Israelis in the Six-Day War the previous summer. I was Jewish. Well, not really, they explained, because to be Jewish by descent, your mother has to be Jewish. But still, I rolled the idea around in my mind, and it was stunning. I had a family with a past, at last, and a family to be proud of, a family that had courage and determination, a family that had made its way in a new land. I was proud of them, and I was proud of my ethnic heritage too, as I thought about the gallant soldiers of the Israeli Defense Force and how they consistently fought and won, outnumbered and outgunned by hostile neighbors. I thought about the ethic of the kibbutz and what I knew of Israel, of the West Pointer, Mickey Marcus, who'd supported the emerging state in the days after World War II. Yes, it felt right to me. I felt complete somehow, in a way I hadn't felt before. I was aching to go back to Chicago now and reconnect with the rest of my family, my father's 5 sisters, their children, his younger brother and family who lived in Arizona. I could hardly wait to tell Mom. I came away from Oxford with an education. I'd lived in another culture where Englishmen could say and mean it, what are laws for except to be obeyed? It was a culture where Alex Hotel was once attacked by an elderly woman with an umbrella for trying to cut into a queue at a bus stop. A culture with a rigid class system where excessive taxes drove the wealthy to spend lavishly on parties and gifts, lest the money be taken by the government anyway, and to discriminate against those who lack the proper accent. A country still struggling to recover its emotional bearings after winning a war and losing an empire. Yet it was also a country of enormous charm and wonderful people, and the fact that we didn't agree on everything stood as no bar to friendship. I learned once again that friendship is about mutual respect and common interests, not about shared political belief. I learned about my country, too. In Great Britain at the time, the United States was resented, misunderstood, and often maligned. You had to talk through the issues and help people see what was behind the headlines. But when you did, and if you spoke in a respectful and open manner, rather than defensively, you could often win their support. Some things weren't easily explained. That spring of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated. And like many others, I was stunned. How could this have happened in our country? The image abroad was that America was out of control. And as the passion against the Vietnam War intensified, I felt less and less able to identify with the emotions at home. The public image of young Americans as angry and rebellious was far removed from my own personal experiences. I could feel my own generation ripping itself apart. It was an extension of all the tensions I'd understood about civil rights and justice, but now associated with countervailing passions and personal rebellion I had not experienced. The rampant anger was a world apart from me and most of my West Point classmates, from ideas of duty and protecting our country. It was time for me to head home, put on a uniform, and take up my Army duties. But even a nation in turmoil, our nation, can show its greatness while its people grapple with urgently compelling issues, as we did in the 1960s. And despite the anger and frustration, the struggle was joined and resolved within the framework of our democracy, just as it should have been. Looking back, a lot of positive social growth came out of that period, growth that should make us all proud today. 5. Vietnam, 1968-1970. We had started hearing about Vietnam back in the early 60s at West Point, and a few of the faculty members had already been there. We read about the deepening war in the newspapers. We discussed it occasionally in class and often in the barracks at night. And by 1965, with the commitment of U.S. ground troops, we all knew and kind of half hoped that we'd be going there. Yes, we'd all heard the scary talk about the Korean War. Quote, the average life expectancy of a second lieutenant in combat is 11 seconds, unquote. But personal combat was still out there for us, a sort of holy grail, and it beckoned. We were young warriors, and many of us wanted nothing more than to be tested in the heat of combat. It may sound strange now, but for many of us there was a certain amount of adventure, even a thrill involved in the anticipation. In the words of President John F. Kennedy, we would, quote, pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty, close quote. And in Vietnam, I'd be proud to be standing up for what I believed in. But by the spring of 1968, this war was no longer abstract to me. My friends from West Point were there in Vietnam, or had already returned home, or while I was studying at Oxford, had already been killed there. Billy Flynn, a toughened soldier when he came to the academy, died in a fierce firefight only 6 months after graduation. My former roommate and close friend Art Parker, who loved playing the Rolling Stones loud on his stereo and who, with his fiancée Connie, double-dated with me and Gert to the old Union Hotel for dinner and cigars in the soft May evenings before graduation. Art was killed when he was hit by a helicopter blade while trying to save the life of a Vietnamese soldier. Rich Hood was killed by gunfire in the Battle of Dak To. Skip McKibben was killed by the splash from a rocket-propelled grenade that hit his tank while he was standing in the commander's hatch and firing its machine gun. Dave Crocker, whose best man I'd been when he wed Ruthie in June of 1966. Jack Farah, who'd roomed across the hall for a year and was the first to tell me about a new English group with funny haircuts, the Beatles. Chuck Johnson from South Carolina, one of my two roommates from Beast Barracks that first summer at West Point, with whom I'd illicitly whispered back and forth at night about our friends and loved ones back home. The list went on and on. Altogether, 31 of the 579 who graduated with my class at West Point were killed in the Vietnam War. They'd done their part, and I would too. I felt a certain amount of guilt for having gone to Oxford for 2 years while my classmates were at war. I felt a need to make up for lost time and a longing to return to my classmates and take up my duty. We'd become members of the Long Gray Line, now fully sharing in the traditions and histories we've been taught. It was a culture of service and sacrifice, of battlefield struggle and long, boring years in between, of men like Eisenhower and Patton, Grant and Lee, and thousands of others who answered their country's call and put duty before self or family. When we finally got to Little Rock after Oxford, I asked Mom why she hadn't told me the truth about my family's background. I meant it as a casual question, not an accusation, but she took it that way. She began to cry and through her tears simply said, "You were a little boy with no father, growing up in a strange place. You didn't need one more problem. I did it to protect you." I know now she wasn't just crying for me, as those were hard times for both of us. And given the latent prejudice she knew awaited us in Little Rock in the 1940s, my father's ethnic identity was a secret she'd chosen to keep. The tragedy that the loss of her husband must have been for her could only have been made worse for both of us if it were known that he were the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. I was 3 weeks out of West Point, including 2 years of study at Oxford, a few weeks at Airborne School, 9 weeks in Ranger School, 6 weeks in the Armor Officer Basic Course learning about tanks, communications, and basic company procedures at Fort Knox, and then 5 months of commanding a tank company of 91 troops at Fort Riley, Kansas in the winter and spring of 1969. Gert was 4 months pregnant when I left for Vietnam in July 1969, and we were able to get her set up to live with another waiting wife. I'd leave Gert behind as well as my mother and stepfather, and I could imagine what they felt. But I tried not to think about that too much. I just kissed Gert goodbye at JFK Airport and walked away. I wrote and I called and I loved her, but Vietnam was what I felt called to do. It was time for me to go. In July 1969, I stepped off the chartered Boeing 707 and into the bright sunshine of Vietnam, carrying the mixed baggages of homesickness, hard determination, and a lot of suppressed excitement. This was it. I'd arrived, one of more than 500,000 American soldiers and Marines inside Vietnam that day, one of the more than 2 million who would serve on the ground in that war. My first impressions were of the noise and confusion. Everything and everybody seemed to be in motion, and the heat seemed unbearable. At first, I didn't know how anyone could live in this environment, but gradually I learned that you accepted it and adapted. There simply was no other choice. I filed off onto the tarmac of Bien Hoa Airfield in Vietnam, loaded my duffel bags on the designated truck, got on the bus that was taking us over to the replacement depot at Long Binh. The lush green vegetation, slashed here and there with the red scars of clay on which new buildings were going up, the rising columns of diesel smoke in the clear morning sky, the flimsy wood construction of the billets, the ever-repeating songs from the musical Hair, blaring from the portable radios. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And overhead, the occasional thump-thump of helicopters, the roar of fighter planes taking off from Benoit Airfield. This was Vietnam. After I'd settled into the transient barracks at the replacement depot, I learned exactly what those columns of diesel smoke represented, and where that sickly sweet smell that wafted across the camp came from. The contents of the metal barrel halves in which the product of open latrines was collected and burned off every morning by some poor soldier who'd somehow angered a first sergeant somewhere. After a couple of days, I got word that I'd be assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1, whose base camp was at Xi'an, a few miles north of Saigon. It took less than an hour to get there, and as soon as I'd disposed of my duffel bags, I reported into the headquarters. I was hoping, of course, to be given command of a company in combat, though I didn't know what my chances of getting such an assignment were. But they'd long known I was coming, and my duties had already been decided for me. The next day, other new arrivals and I were given a class and taken out on patrol. "This is how we do it here," they said. "This is how you will do it." It was about infantry patrol movement and flank security and setting up claymore mines and making sure everyone had enough water. But we had live ammo, and we might theoretically have to fight. However, there were no tracks, no indicators, no enemy. As it turned out, the training patrol was just a long walk through waist-high grass and the occasional cluster of palms. And in the rainy season, it was about standing around in a drenching tropical downpour that went on for 2 hours. Early the next morning, I got the summons. "Captain Clark, get your gear, you're leaving early." But instead of heading into combat to lead an infantry company, I was being sent to the division headquarters, another 30 miles north at Lai Khe. I was going to be placed on the division staff as one of several hundred officers associated with the headquarters. It was rear area duty. No patrols, no air assaults, no leadership. What a disappointment. But that's the Army, I figured. You don't always get the job you want. You have to do well the job they give you. I spent 6 months at Lai Khe, interrupted by the occasional helicopter ride or jeep trip out. For the first month, I helped out the division's Assistant Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Murchison. Then I went to work for the Division Operations Officer, or G3, Lieutenant Colonel Rick Brown. He'd been one of my mentors at West Point, and when he learned I'd arrived in Vietnam, he managed to get me assigned to the division headquarters, out of the normal rotation cycle, in order to beef up his staff. I headed up a small team that helped analyze operations and plan future efforts, and in addition, I became the division's briefing officer. Every afternoon at 5 p.m., I had to succinctly summarize the day's operations for the commanding general and other members of the division staff. The job was challenging and interesting. I could go anywhere, ask just about anything, and report back in with information. It was a great education in how a 17,000-man division operated in combat. I watched the division commander chew out a battalion commander for driving his vehicles across a rice paddy and ruining the crop. I heard the concern in commanders' voices as they sought air and artillery support in battle or offered battle analyses and suggested new operations. I became more aware every day of the anxieties that burden high-level commanders in war. But mostly I had to prepare the daily command briefing, and this was more difficult than it might appear. The main problem was that the information that came in was often inaccurate or incomplete or both. Was it 2 rifles or 2 machine guns captured? By which company of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry? And what had they done with the captured enemy soldier? Wasn't that where they found a weapons cache last month? And what was that Vietnamese Army unit doing in the area anyway? It was 10 minutes of briefing followed by 10 minutes of gotcha if you weren't careful. Sir, for the last 3 days, the 1st of the 18th has been conducting a sweep from northwest to southeast in search of VC logistics elements thought to be operating in the Bin Suc area in this general region. Maps were all important aspects of these briefings. About 8 feet tall, attached to wall panels, they were slid back and forth on rails to face the seated men drinking in the information. Before each briefing, friendly forces were shown by symbols of various colors scotch-taped to the acetate-covered maps, while suspected enemy locations were shown similarly, but always in red. These acetates were updated whenever new intelligence came in, but the locations of units and their use on both sides could be very tricky. I used a pointer indicating on the map either specific or general locations I was discussing, marking each event with a blue or red acetate number. but my audience was seldom passive, and my interaction with those being briefed was almost constant. Sir, at Location 1, our intelligence indicates that 4 or 5 days ago, one VC patrol came into the Tan Yuen area over here to join a platoon already in place in order to... Captain Clark, you just said one platoon was already in place in the Tan Yuen area? Well, that's news to me. How long has it been there? Sir, I'm not sure, and the intelligence is mixed. Some of our sources have been reporting its presence for some time, but most of those early accounts were deemed unreliable and ignored. Well, that's pretty important information. Our intelligence yesterday said there was no VC main force unit there. Now, which is it? Sir, right now I can't tell you. We'll find out. I want you to get together with G2 on this, work it out between you, and get back to me right away. Yes, sir. I'll meet with G2 and the G3 right after this briefing. Okay, continue. You always took responsibility first, then sorted it out later, for that was the military ethic. I went in with shined boots and freshly pressed jungle fatigues, and I was lucky if I came out in one piece, since the division's senior officers had been out flying around all day, visiting units, checking activities, and getting a sense for what was happening, knowing that at every moment their men's lives were on the line. Occasionally an enemy rocket would land in the headquarters area, which meant we weren't exactly safe, and I habitually slept with a loaded M16 in my bunk on the base perimeter. Still, it was definitely rear area duty. The one saving grace of the assignment was a few free evenings that I used to meet up with an Army chaplain so I could convert to Catholicism. I'd grown up a Baptist, but as I went to Mass with Gert at Oxford, I'd become especially impressed with Father Michael Hollings, a former infantry officer in the British Coldstream Guards, a regiment that had fought in World War II at the Battle of El Alamein. We talked about God, life, the Catholic Church, and war. The Protestant ministers I met at Oxford seemed to take a short-sighted view of Christian duty during wartime, and I often heard our soldiers condemned for their service, as though these ministers could deny us access to God. Never from Father Michael. He understood the terrible dilemma of duty. Through him, my appreciation for the structure and strength of the Catholic Church grew stronger. I only needed the time and relative stability of the base camp in Vietnam to convert. My staff job at division headquarters was still interesting, for I had access to most of the same information as the division commander, and I was seeing the war from his perspective, but I desperately wanted the chance to command a company in the field. It didn't matter which company I commanded. I just wanted to engage, to start actually fighting this war instead of watching and analyzing as it happened around me. I knew that command of a company in combat could be an all-important part of learning leadership in the Army. I often thought back to West Point. In our military history class, we'd been studying Napoleon, and one morning I encountered my company tactical officer, then Captain Wardle Hardy, West Point class of '56, as I was walking out of the classroom. "Well, Mr. Clark," he asked, "how's your study of Napoleon coming?" Well, that particular morning, we just finished discussing Napoleon's great victory at the Battle of Marengo, where he demonstrated his developing skill at maneuver while commanding an army of some 30,000 troops. For me, it had been one of those revealing moments, and as I was leaving the classroom, I was pretty fired up. "Sir, we've just been over the Battle of Marengo, and now I think I know how he did it and how to direct an army." "That's fine, Mr. Clark," he answered, "but don't ever forget, you have to know how to lead a company before you can lead an army." No, I hadn't forgotten. And meanwhile, the weeks passed. Rainy season was almost over. An effort to move the division to a different area had been nixed by higher headquarters, and the division soon was told that it would be sent home. The first full combat unit to depart Vietnam under President Richard Nixon's Vietnamization program. I began to wonder if I'd ever get a company command assignment outside the headquarters. It was natural for them to keep me there, since I'd earned their trust and the time was almost too short to train someone else to handle the assignment. Still, I couldn't forget Wardle Hardy's advice to learn how to command a company. On the other side of the base camp, my friend and West Point classmate, Captain Dave Arthur, was departing after his year's tour. He'd done it the normal way, beginning as a company commander and then after 6 months moving up to become the assistant operations officer for 3rd Brigade. I went by to say goodbye and wish him well. "Wes," he said, "be careful when you get out there. Stay alert and don't get ahead of yourself. I had a close call. A guy popped up right out of a spider hole as we were going through a base camp, right in front of me. He looked up, saw me, tried to raise his rifle, but I nailed him, face to face. You never got hit, did you? I asked. Nope, he said. I was lucky. But he was also good, I thought. Dave was one of the most capable and competent leaders in our class. He was a real soldier, a fighter, a man any soldier would follow. I spoke to Colonel Brown and asked for his help in getting out to the field, and the Division Chief of Staff, Colonel Al Hume, was sympathetic. He understood the torture of being sidelined and may have felt it a little himself in the division headquarters, despite his critical position there. At last there was an opening, not in an armor or armored cavalry outfit for which I was best qualified, but in a mechanized infantry battalion, which had armored vehicles, occasionally worked with tanks, and was often commanded by armor officers. In early January, I was given command of A Company, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry, mechanized. For the first few days, we simply continued the standing operating procedure, which was to conduct mounted patrols through areas designated by the battalion commander. Sometimes we were assigned to reconnoiter a specific objective, which we normally did while mounted in our armored personnel carriers. Sometimes we were accompanied by tanks and their heavy fire support, but usually we were not. The major danger here was from mines, and since the APCs were loaded with ammunition and explosives, most of us rode on top for our own safety. If there was a firefight, we could either dismount or jump down inside, and if we hit a mine, the theory went, we'd simply be blown off the top of the vehicle. However accurate that may have been, it was standard operating procedure. When we arrived in an area in late afternoon, we set up an RON, remain overnight, position. We chopped down trees or removed brush in order to clear landing zones. For the medical evacuation helicopters, we called dust-offs, angelic miracles that would arrive on call after less than half an hour and could usually carry their wounded cargo to an American hospital within even less time than that. Little did I know how important this near-miraculous medical rescue capability would soon enough be to me personally. We formed our APCs in a rough circle, with me and my command vehicle in the center. I usually slept on a cot pitched right beside my vehicle, but I slept little because I'd get up every couple of hours to walk the perimeter. Each morning, just before sunrise, we had a stand-to, which meant everyone was up and at their weapon, ready to fire, and radio checks were made with higher and lower headquarters, and then we began that day's operation. At night and in the afternoons, I'd talk with the soldiers, always assessing, probing, motivating. I watched as we moved, looking for techniques we might improve on, mistakes we could correct. If we weren't fighting, we had to be training, not just riding along while waiting for the next day. Our intelligence said that the enemy had begun to break his forces down into small units, and so the hard part was to find him and make contact, after which we could mass our firepower against him. So I began to more frequently break the company down and have my 3 platoons go out independently on foot patrols. Each day I try to join one of the platoons, and that's where I was on February 19, 1970, when I almost bought the farm. The lessons of leadership I learned in Vietnam would last a lifetime. Working with a diverse team to impart skills, to motivate and inspire, innovating and adapting, taking the initiative, above all, making an honest appraisal, taking honest feedback, including the kind of veiled criticism you can pick up if you're tuned into it, in order to make a better outfit. It was leadership, plain and simple. What people look like on the outside isn't always who they are on the inside, and what they say often isn't what they mean. You read their body language while maintaining distance and composure, but you take a personal interest in their families and problems. You listen more than you speak, and when you make a decision, you explain it and then hang tough. And when people, especially leaders, fail, you face up to it and take action. Leadership's about experience, not books, and people, not theories. The company commander had to set the standard. He had to live it himself, not just enforce it. You had to be personally competent and squared away. You were always on display, and every word, act, or expression was judged. Just like at West Point, you were, quote, graded every day, unquote. You had to teach others who weren't as good, and in this army of conscripts, you had to motivate your soldiers. You did that with humor and personal interest if you could, and while an occasional sharp word might be needed, you never made or allowed a personal attack, For anything negative that involved your men, you used the chain of command. Lieutenants and sergeants normally handled and resolved such issues before they reached the old man at the top. The company commander always had to have a plan. He had to know where he was and where he was going. No uncertainty, no waffling or wavering on decisions. Mostly, these decisions weren't life and death matters, and many of them were insignificant. But you had to build a kind of informal authority that bonded the men to you and would command their respect, obedience, and support when the issue was one of life and death. Years later, military historian John Keegan called this the mask of command. But it wasn't a mask. It had to be authentic and deep, because when you're living with men day in and day out, there's no privacy, and any such mask would quickly be exposed. Phonies couldn't make it, and you had to really lead, not pretend. One day early in my command, I'd watched as one of my platoons moved past on mounted patrol about 100 meters away. Each of the tracks carried 5 or 6 men, and I observed them closely. A driver, a vehicle commander crouched behind the .50 caliber machine gun, and 3 or 4 other riflemen sitting or lying on top. Some of them were eating from C-ration cans. Some were reading magazines or books, while most of them just looked groggy in the unrelenting hot sun. This was my baseline assessment. We could and would do better, more alert, more disciplined, more effective. So I worked steadily to make the men more alert and the unit more effective. But there were limits to what we, a bunch of young Americans, could be or become. We weren't social workers or linguists or experts in economic and political development, and it wasn't our country either. But these experiences in the field, some flawed more deeply than others, provided food for thought. Were our tactics right? Or might we have done better with smaller groups of more highly skilled soldiers, able to live in the jungle and fight the enemy on his own terms? Was our approach to the Vietnamese culture correct? Or should we have been more in touch with the local Vietnamese, the people we were supposed to be protecting, but whom we never got to know, at least in the 1st Infantry Division with whom I served? From what I saw, we were trying hard to follow the counterinsurgency guidelines of winning the hearts and minds of the people. At least I heard a lot of talk to that effect from our senior officers. But were we really able to do that? And was our strategy right with the continued withdrawals of U.S. forces after about 1969, the on and off negotiations with the North, and the Vietnamization program? I sensed I was too close to the issues to have good answers for everything then, but I was open to the questions. Today, there are many young men and women serving in Iraq and Afghanistan who believe in each other and in America. They're doing their best with the mission our country gave them. Some of them probably wouldn't change a thing. Others are asking questions, and some probably would want us to bring our forces there home right away. I just want them to take care of each other while following their orders and adhering to their guidelines. It's up to the political leadership and the top brass to think through the political issues and the strategy. But so far, they haven't lived up to their obligations to the troops or to our country. One thing, however, is clear. Today, men and women in uniform are respected, admired, and loved by Americans of every political stripe, and that surely is a big step beyond the trauma that was Vietnam. 6. Healing Wounds, 1970-1980. It was around 5 p.m. on the 19th of February, 1970, when the helicopter landed me at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital outside Saigon. The medics on board had looked at my wounds and taken me to the hospital for the less seriously injured. The really bad cases, the men with the sucking chest wounds and guts ripped open, the ones who might not make it, who would require extensive time before they could be moved again, were sent to the 24th evac. I was pretty much out of it by this time, just trying to avoid thinking and feeling pain. The next thing I remember was a doctor looking down at me after x-ray. "You've got the $1 million wound," he said. I tried to talk without showing the panic I felt, for I thought that phrase had something to do with the ability to father more children. "Relax," he said. "You've taken 4 rounds, shoulder, leg, hand, and butt, and not a major blood vessel, bone, or nerve has been damaged. You're a very lucky guy, and you'll be headed back to the States soon." I was getting very groggy as I was taken into another room and moved from the gurney to an operating table. As I lay back, I again felt a needle pricking my arm, and then the lights went out. After surgery, I slept for quite a while. When I woke up, I found I was in a bed in a ward with perhaps a dozen other wounded. Some of the officers from the division came to see me, including Lieutenant Colonel David Martin, my battalion commander. 2 of my soldiers had also been wounded in the action, though not as seriously as I was. We'd overrun the base camp and found some enemy blood trails where they'd pulled away their dead or wounded. The other platoons had eventually arrived on the scene after I'd been evacuated, and the area had then been cleared of enemy presence. I watched a few minutes later as an injured soldier, a young African-American man who lost his arm at mid-bicep, smoked and talked with his friends. "How's Big Dog? What's happened to Smitty? Stay in touch, you hear?" He was still connected, engaged, missing his unit, and I knew exactly how he felt. But I looked at the stump of his arm, and I wondered what life would bring to him, whether he'd be able to maintain that positive spirit when reality hit him a few months from now. And I prayed he would, for I knew that many of us were headed home with wounds that would never really heal. A few days later, they hooked me up to a portable IV and then put me on a stretcher and loaded me on a bus with 8 or 10 other stretcher-borne, homeward-bound casualties. The bus lurched across rough ground to the airfield, stretchers swaying in their slings, men moaning from the heat and the rough ride. But the driver had a portable radio turned way up loud, and the latest hit that poured through the bus was a not-so-strangely soothing number by Peter, Paul, and Mary, with the mellow, haunting words, "Leaving on a jet plane." In ways beyond verbal description, that song, whenever I hear it, I still find it touches my soul. There were 2 great joys awaiting me when I got home, Gert and our 4-month-old son, Wes. Gert met me in the hospital at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. We sneaked out, with me in pajamas and casts on my leg and hand, to have dinner somewhere. She was so excited she drove the car over a curb and into a ditch. It was raining lightly, and there I was again, 3 years later, outside the car, in the rain, and pushing. But that didn't matter. Nothing mattered, really, for I was finally home. A week later, I was given convalescent leave to go to Brooklyn, where we'd stay with her parents. As soon as we got there, with my right arm in a cast and my hand formed around a steel hook, I held my son. "Don't drop him," Gert said, as she put him carefully across my right arm. It was one of the greatest moments of my life. I spent a few more weeks healing in the hospital, but as soon as the wounds closed and I could remove the casts, I was on my way to my next job at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I became a company commander in the 194th Armored Brigade, a school support unit. I was given command of a tank company that was authorized 91 men, but only had about 70 assigned, and our job was to fix tanks that were used in the school cycles for training new lieutenants. Most of my men were early returnees from Vietnam, some of whom had been wounded, while others had various personal problems, but the majority of them were just waiting to complete their enlistments and get out. It was the draft army of the early 1970s, and we had soldiers of every background and motivation. Some were drafted after finishing college or graduate school when their student deferments ran out. These men were smart. They could have gone on to OCS, Officer Candidate School, but had chosen to ride out their 2 years of service in the ranks. Sometimes all that education made them the kind of informal leaders that everyone listened to, regardless of how many stripes they had. On the other hand, some were pretty unhappy about serving. Some were drafted after high school graduation, the more gifted of whom were sent to an additional Army school and became sergeants. They were a little inexperienced compared to most of the other sergeants, but they were usually well motivated. And with casualties in Vietnam a constant drain, they were sorely needed. And all of these men were draftees. Our job was not pleasant, to fix broken-down M60 tanks so that new lieutenants could train on them. Needless to say, morale was pretty low when I took over. We would get a standard mission to deliver 12 tanks to range such and such at 0400 hours, all with operating infrared sights and so on. And then we would pick them up at 0100 hours the next day and get them ready for the next cycle of lieutenants. So this became a sort of round-the-clock school support mission in which we'd go straight out for weeks and then even months at a time. In fact, that summer we worked more than 80 straight days and nights, weekends included. When you add the Command Maintenance Management Inspections, or CMMIs, that we had to undergo, that was quite a bit of pressure on us. That summer was a crazy time in the Army, with the Vietnam War at its peak. Experienced non-commissioned officers were refusing to re-enlist. Serious discipline problems were frequent. One night, a soldier from another unit lobbed a Molotov cocktail at the military police station, and another night, 2 soldiers fought a duel with .22 caliber pistols. Absent without leave offenses as well as drug abuse incidents were rampant, and the Army had just been directed to transition to an all-volunteer force. In Vietnam, meanwhile, the fighting continued. My friend from Oxford, Alex Hotel, had extended his tour for another 6 months. He'd had a rough go already as an infantry company commander in a very high-risk area, and he'd earned a reputation as a tough, savvy, cool-headed leader in combat. Because of the high risk, Alex advised his men to write a letter home, just in case. When there was a break in the action, he wrote a letter to his wife, Linda, from which the following passages are excerpted. Says Alex, "I loved the Army. It reared me, it nurtured me, it gave me the most satisfying years of my life. Thanks to it, I've lived an entire lifetime in 26 years. It's only fitting that I should die in its service. We all have but one death to spend, and insofar as it can have any meaning, it finds it in the service of comrades in arms. And yet, I deny that I died for anything. Not my country, not my army, not my fellow man, none of these things. I lived for these things, and the manner in which I chose to do it involved the very real chance that I would die in the execution of my duties. I knew this and accepted it. But my love for West Point and the Army was great enough, and the promise that I'd someday be able to serve all the ideals that meant anything to me through it was great enough for me to accept this possibility as part of a price which must be paid for all things of great value. If there's nothing worth dying for in this sense, there is nothing worth living for." As a fighting company commander, Alex saw a lot of combat, and he earned 2 Silver Stars for valor. Then he was reassigned, and as an aide to the commanding general, he no longer had any reason to think he might die a violent death in Vietnam. But no one ever did. On July 17, 1970, Alex Hotel was killed in a helicopter crash. But he got it exactly right. Our country, our Army, our fellow men and women, something to live for. Back at Fort Knox, leadership was a matter of caring, putting in the hours, working alongside the troops, and above all, standing up for them. I was still convalescing from my wounds and soon discovered I couldn't run, do the monkey bars, or shoot a pistol. But I was there walking through the barracks at night, getting soldiers released from jail for minor offenses off post, helping change track in the mud on Saturday afternoon, inspecting maintenance records on Sunday morning, leading tank columns around at 3 a.m. on the tank trails at Fort Knox, and above all, pep-talking the troops, often one by one. This command had a profound effect on me. These men performed out of pride in themselves and duty to their country, many of them still gimped from wounds, others champing at the bit to start over on the outside, but they pulled together. We were a sacrifice outfit as we saw it, and we were brothers. And with them, I had family, real family. I commanded that company from May through September 1970. Then I went to the Armor Officer Advanced Course for a 9-month program that was designed to bring us into the inner sanctums of tactics, logistics, and leadership. This was done mostly through lectures, memorization, and monthly examinations. Here, I'd have time to regain the strength in my wounded hand, to learn to run again on a leg that was missing a lot of muscle. And here, too, many of the Army's Vietnam-era problems were on display. We were a special group, a bunch of infantry and armor captains, all Vietnam veterans, whose assignments had somehow gotten out of sequence, so we were thrown together in what might have been an overflow course. Many of us had deep problems, some with their wounds, some with their marriages, others with the Army and the guilt and frustration over the war. Some were now affected by the anger on the outside directed against us. They wore their hair a little long, they slouched a little, and brought some of that cool into our group. There were the predictable quarrels among us. But above all, we shared a deep anxiety about the war, the Army, and the country. Brigadier General George S. Patton III, the son of the famous World War II commander, was sparkling in his fancy blue mess uniform at the dining inn for the 100-odd captains and majors in the Armor Officer Advanced Course, Class 501-71. It was late April of 1971, and General Patton had recently arrived at Fort Knox, where he was assigned as the Assistant Commandant of the U.S. Army Armor School. He was determined to impart his fire-breathing, hard-charging style of combat leadership to the Vietnam veteran captains, listening intently to his analysis of Vietnam and leadership, for he, too, knew we were having real leadership problems across the Army. In the news that week, a U.S. infantry battalion had failed under battle stress along the Laotian border, with an infantry company having refused to advance toward the border despite the best efforts of the company commander. He'd been replaced, and another commander also failed to get the unit to move. The Army was failing under fire. It was unforgivable. If I'd been there, said Patton, I'd simply have moved out myself, walked on forward, led them on foot personally. These are American soldiers. They'll follow brave leaders. They wouldn't let me go into battle alone. Do any of you doubt that? Well, do you? I looked around at my fellow officers, at the rows of Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars and Silver Stars. You could fairly see the skepticism boiling over. We knew it wasn't that easy. I'd worked hard the year before, and my men had come forward under fire. But would every unit respond the same way and to someone they didn't know? We challenged him, forced him to defend his assumptions, and recognized the doubts that so many had about the reliability of a draft army fighting the 6th year of a bitterly unpopular war. The old respect for authority was disappearing. In its place were doubt, cynicism, alienation, isolation, and hostility. A good leader could still motivate troops, but it took a good leader, not just a set of captain's bars on a collar. Now, General Patton was one of those leaders. He didn't bark us down when he was challenged. Instead, he listened and engaged with us. He knew, too, that the Army was in trouble, and he was doing his best to help. Much of the Army had simply been used up. Good officers and non-commissioned officers were being killed, wounded, or retired. The individual replacement system in combat was producing units of strangers who, without extraordinary leadership, simply didn't bond, and the troops themselves, who increasingly felt discriminated against and picked on by a society that forced them to fight a war that it's largely opposed, were simply not re-enlisting. Some armies can be defeated on the field of battle. Ours was not. But we who lived through the trauma of Vietnam can never forget the sense of an army that had lost its edge and was rapidly losing its capabilities. The summer of 1971, I was sent to the Pentagon for 3 months to help work the transition of the Army to the all-volunteer force. When that assignment was over, I was off to West Point to repay the support and mentoring I'd received by giving back to others as an assistant professor in the Social Sciences Department. I wouldn't be back with troops for 5 years. West Point felt like home. I would be one of perhaps 1,000 officers on the faculty and staff, and one of 50-odd in the Department of Social Sciences. All of us focused primarily on developing the cadets. I taught economics for part of a semester and then moved over to teach an elective seminar in political philosophy, from Plato to Herbert Marcuse. It was a time of civil disobedience, of popular questions about the Vietnam War and the legitimacy of government, so the course was in high demand among cadets. In addition to teaching, I was able to help coach the debate team and serve as one of the assistant coaches on the swim team. With Gert's family close and Wes a toddler, it was a busy, family-oriented 3 years. After the first year, we were able to move into a wonderful old apartment within walking distance of Thayer Hall, where my office was. And there were tailgate parties for football games, a walk a few hundred yards to the hockey rink, and easy access to many friends. But much of the action at West Point was out of sight of the cadets, for West Point at the time was all about Vietnam. Our superintendent, Lieutenant General Bill Knowlton, had served as an assistant division commander in Vietnam with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong River Delta, and almost everyone on the faculty had served a tour somewhere in Southeast Asia. By this time, of course, the war was deeply unpopular in the civilian world. Most of the officers on the faculty had been exposed to a healthy dose of academic skepticism or even criticism when they attended civilian graduate schools in preparation for returning to teach at West Point, but especially for those of us too young to have served in Korea in the 1950s. Vietnam was the centerpiece of our Army experiences, and it weighed heavily on us. At the same time as the 1971 Army was being ripped by tides of racial unrest and deep soldier unhappiness, draftees were still coming in, bringing with them all the frictions and tensions in the larger society. And writing a review of David Halberstam's Best and the Brightest for an academic journal, I was forced to confront and think through my views on Vietnam. It wasn't easy, and I finally produced a rather complicated analysis full of hypotheticals and conditionals, and the editor rightly asked for clarifications. As I did so, I worked through some of the issues with a military colleague and former social sciences instructor who was then serving in the White House under President Nixon. My questions and hypotheticals must have hit a raw nerve. Quote, "If you have to ask questions like this, you aren't on the team," unquote, he wrote back on my marked-up draft. It was chilling. This wasn't the Army I was part of. Or was it just the proximity to the Nixon administration that fueled the response? I sensed that much of the Army outside West Point was hunkered down, repaying civilian hostility with an enforced loyalty that served the extremes in both cultures. But that loyalty only worked to further isolate the military from the society it was formed to protect. I stayed firmly fixed on the bridge between the two perspectives. I was an Army officer. We weren't baby killers, and I loved and respected the men and women I'd served with. On the other hand, it was hard to believe that no mistakes had been made in Vietnam. Similarly, it was sometimes hard to defend every previous civilian policymaker who took action to contain communism at its periphery and enforce legal actions, which decreed South Vietnam a separate and independent state. There were good people and well-intentioned people on both sides of this painful debate. Once again, I was reminded of the disputes over desegregation in Little Rock years before. People argued superficially about facts, but the real disagreements were about principles. Each side mustered many of them. To make headway in any discussion, you had to work on small, specific areas where some agreement might be found, and in the process, you risked being misunderstood or even attacked by both sides. By early 1973, the Nixon administration had concluded its negotiations with the North Vietnamese to gain the freedom of our captured American pilots. The price was to assent to a North Vietnamese army encamped in the center of South Vietnam. The New York Times sent a reporter to interview several of us. "Will it work?" we were asked. Well, it was a flawed agreement, I explained. It may have been the best we could get, given the American public's determination to end our involvement, but by leaving a North Vietnamese force inside South Vietnam, we were guaranteeing that the conflict would resume, and the outcome would probably be bad. I had a sinking feeling as I criticized the agreement. Our country had been working almost 5 years to achieve this, and I respected the hard negotiations and tough choices that had been made. No doubt it was the best that could have been done, and here I was, a captain on active duty, publicly criticizing the commander-in-chief. I was uneasy about being critical, but largely I was conscious of the need to judge, the weight of the assessment, the risk of being wrong, and being wrong publicly. I felt a heavy sense of responsibility and weighed my words carefully. This, of course, is precisely how we learn to make high-quality judgments, and it's always serious and anxiety-ridden. The key is to have foresight and to be accurate in what's foreseen. During the summer of 1973, I was given a 3-month position on the Army staff in the Pentagon with the charter to investigate 3 issues. Was there an energy crisis? Yes, but artificially created. Would it impact Department of Defense operational readiness? Not really. Would there be any role for U.S. military power in dealing with the situation in the Persian Gulf? Yes, but not immediately and not necessarily in open warfare. But in recommending that military forces might become part of a U.S. response, I'd crossed another red line. Political leaders wanted no further mention of possible military missions. One of the wise lieutenant colonels on the Army staff delivered the warning unforgettably. "Young captain, You put that recommendation in your report, that Senator Fulbright's going to call all of us up there in front of him for an explanation, and it won't be pretty. So savvy officers watched what they said and what they wrote. They heeded the political overtones. They didn't address issues above their pay grades, and they stayed away from policy and the politics associated with it, if at all possible. After all, this was not the Department of Social Sciences. Among its other virtues, this approach assured that the military could enthusiastically support whatever policies were adopted by their civilian superiors, without awkwardly having to retract their earlier views. General MacArthur had clearly spelled it out to us in his June 1962 farewell address at West Point. Quote, "Others will debate the controversial issues, national and international, which divide men's minds. But serene, calm, aloof, you stand as the nation's war guardians." I was in a bit of a quandary. Here I was working on policy, and everything I'd been taught told me to speak up, not publicly, but privately, and give my bosses my best unvarnished judgment. I'd gone to Oxford precisely to gain better understanding of the civilian society in order to help the military serve it better. This was about integrity, not gamesmanship. I didn't feel undue concern or fear when I talked about these issues. I just looked at the facts and reasoned it out. But wasn't this what was needed? Ultimately, I did brief the leadership. I laid out my prediction. The 3-star general nodded and remarked, "You may be right." Well, that summer of 1973, I returned to West Point for my final year of teaching. Captain Dan Chrisman and I wrote an article for Military Review suggesting that because of the energy crisis, the Middle East had taken on new significance and that U.S. forces might be required to stabilize the region. Of course, we had to submit the draft article to the Pentagon for clearance. 4.5 years later, it was published. I wasn't called up in front of the Senate, but neither had the savvy lieutenant colonel been wrong exactly, as I learned repeatedly over the years. There can be a high price to be paid for addressing policy matters, even if you're later proven right. And for that reason, policymakers too often go uninformed by the kind of military reasoning they say they want, but don't always receive. Leaders brave in battle sometimes need encouragement in the conference room. In the spring of 1974, Gert and I took 4 cadets to an academic symposium on civil-military relations at Brown University. It would be a long weekend away and a useful effort, I thought. The symposium crowd was friendly enough. Issues passed quickly on college campuses, and with the draft a historical relic, students quickly forgot the anger generated by the war. But the speakers didn't. Gazing down from the stage at the 4 cadets and me, all of us in uniform and seated near the front, Congressman Les Aspin pointed us out and said, "Those cadets and that officer there, they'll never again see the time when American troops are deployed overseas to combat." It was a bold statement, and issuing from the lips of a Rhodes Scholar, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and one of the up-and-coming stars of the dominant Democratic Party, it was authoritative as well. His statement also struck me in an odd personal way. Why would I want to stay in the military, I just turned 29, if we would never again be called on to defend the country? But the flip side was equally troubling. If there was to be a big war in Europe with the Soviets, why would anyone want to be in the middle of that? The cadets enjoyed rubbing elbows with their civilian contemporaries, but I carried the disturbing questions away with me. What was the usefulness of the Army? Would we ever be needed again? And what were the right lessons to take from Vietnam? No one seemed to have any answers. All too soon, the Clarks were packing to leave West Point. Young Wes was 4 years old. I was to be a student at the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. West Point had been good to us. I had lots of time there with Gert and Wes, with close friends, and with family nearby, and I liked both the teaching as well as my colleagues in the Social Sciences Department. And if this wasn't quite the dessert course like Oxford, it was pretty close. I was eager to get back to soldiering with the troops, but I also realized that when I left the faculty at West Point, the future was unknown. To me, much had been given, and I'd spent a wonderful 3 years giving back. Now I believed I could get on with the real Army. They called it the Big Bedroom, an auditorium that held the whole Leavenworth class of some 1,200 officers. But nobody was asleep that early morning in 1974 when we assembled for the welcoming ceremony at which we'd be briefed by the Commandant of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. We stood around spotting friends from other assignments, former bosses, classmates from previous schools. Most had earned medals in 2 tours in Vietnam, Bronze Stars, Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, Air Medal, Army Commendation Medal with V device, Purple Hearts, Silver Stars, and more. We saw the foreign officers in our midst, German, Peruvian, British, Israeli, Jordanian, Ethiopian, South Vietnamese, Cambodian, all in all more than 100 officers from dozens of different countries. Then we took our seats, stood, sat, stood again, and welcomed our Commandant, Lieutenant General John B. Jack Cushman, former commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. He stood before us, ramrod straight, broad-shouldered, with a full head of dark hair. He had a reputation for shaking things up, and he'd already made a mark in just a few months with the previous class. But we were to be the first class he'd have for a full year. As General Cushman explained it, we'd have to learn to think and reason tactically. Rote memorization of some of the basic facts would still be required, the range of a Soviet anti-tank missile, say. And the curriculum would feature more electives, including advanced tactics, at the highest levels of command, and that meant more responsibility for students. What we didn't really talk about was Vietnam. And you couldn't talk about your Vietnam experiences simply because that topic just wasn't tolerated. We'd all had some heady times over there, but the war was over, and it was time to move on. Occasionally someone would start a thought with, well, when I was in Nam, only to be met by a low hiss of disapproval and people turning away. There were no good war stories from Vietnam, not anymore. Instead, we were busy studying the new Soviet equipment and their threat to Europe, and reflecting on the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where the Syrians and the Egyptians had used Soviet tactics and equipment to nearly defeat Israel in the early days. But for me, the questions raised by Congressman Aspen were still nagging. I mulled over how to wrestle with the challenge. Does the Army really have a future? And stumbled into a method. I'd do some real individual research on the use of force. I volunteered to skip a couple of electives in order to write a thesis and gain a newly accredited postgraduate degree, Master of Military Art and Science, that the college was now empowered to award. The subject would be contingency operations since World War II. I started with the German philosopher of war, Klaus von Clausewitz, and his magisterial work on war. For him, it was the connection between war and political ends that was the key. For in Clausewitz's time, war was used to attain a short-term political end. In his day, when there were no nuclear weapons and international conflict didn't threaten all of civilization, war was just another set of activities that, properly understood and used, could lead to the desired political outcome. Within this framework, it would be possible to ask whether various military actions met the higher aims of political leaders, and if so, to determine the characteristics of these successful operations. In the course of the inquiry, I was unable to avoid reopening the issues of Vietnam. I'd been through most of the literature before, but now was the time to go back through it. The Pentagon Papers, Francis Fitzgerald's Fire in the Lake, Thomas Schelling on his theory of compellence, news articles, policy pronouncements, and other materials. What were we thinking at the time? How could it have gone so wrong with the public? Gradually, I teased out the major pieces of a modern military and foreign affairs policy appropriate for our nation. Having a clear goal, knowing your enemy's character and aims, going in with overwhelming power, maintaining a psychological and physical dominance if the level of fighting intensified, beating the enemy on the battlefield in order to beat him in the negotiations. It was diplomatic in purpose, military in means. Coercive diplomacy was what some of us called it. I spent time at the kitchen table every night with a box of 3x5 card notes, the references, and my old portable typewriter from West Point, pecking out my ideas. Then in late March, General Cushman assembled the class again in the big bedroom. Men, he began, today Saigon has fallen to the enemy. He went on for a few minutes to speak the requiem to America's long and costly war in Southeast Asia. This was no war story, and nobody hissed. There was a stunned silence. We looked at each other, a few eyes glistening as we thought about all the friends we'd lost and the blood we'd spilled, the months and years of our lives we'd given to that cause. Until that moment, it had been easy to push it off the front burner, though it continued to simmer slowly in the back of all our minds. But now, Vietnam was front and center once again. It simply couldn't be avoided. The fall of South Vietnam to communism was pure, raw pain. Pain for the loss, pain for the wasted effort, pain for the humiliation of our country. We were never the same class again. The Cambodians left immediately to fly home. The Vietnamese officers, 18 of them, left promptly to take any cash-paying job in Kansas City. A couple of them ended up as waiters in restaurants. At least they had their families with them, because they weren't going home again, not for a long time. As for the rest of us, we found ourselves approaching our studies with a new purpose and a new resolve. This wasn't going to happen again. Not to our country. We wouldn't let it. We would win. We would speak out, demand what we needed, refuse to be misled or buffaloed by the politicians at the top. That was a resolve many of us shared. As I looked back on Vietnam, it became ever clearer what had gone wrong. If the struggle could have been won militarily, it would have taken greater and earlier pressure on North Vietnam, more direct action to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, far greater risks in dealing with the problem of Soviet and Chinese assistance to the north, and a greater emphasis on population-centered protection far earlier in the war. We'd committed a lot of American power, but we hadn't fought smart at the strategic and geostrategic levels. The generals had been hesitant to ask for what they really needed. The politicians had been reluctant to take the risks we needed in order to win. If there was a single lesson, it was this: no half measures. Don't commit American forces unless you commit enough to win. I would carry those lessons with me. Repackaged in the introduction for Project 14, General Wickham's transition report, they became the basis for the Powell Doctrine. In the mid-1990s, I drew on the same set of ideas when organizing the military annex to the Dayton Peace Agreement. And once again, as 54-year-old general serving in General Eisenhower's old command as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, waging war against the forces of Serb dictator Slobodan Milosevic, I found myself drawing on the lessons I'd pulled out of those few months at Fort Leavenworth as a 30-year-old captain trying to understand Vietnam. They're the lessons of modern warfare. They're equally applicable in Iraq today, where political leaders intervened in a far-off land, committed a force too small, and failed to deal effectively with Iraq's neighbors who fed the conflict. No two strategic problems, of course, are identical. But just as the Johnson administration avoided applying full power against North Vietnam for fear of Soviet and Chinese reactions, so too has the Bush administration failed to reckon with the interests of Iraq's neighbors. Some of them, despite their denials, have worked steadily against the American effort in Iraq in order to protect their own quite different interests. Instead of threatening these states, the Bush administration needed to find a way to make them part of the solution in the region. That, however, would have required diplomatic engagement and sustained dialogue, key governmental tools that the Bush people have refused to employ. I made a lot of good friends at Fort Leavenworth, friends Gert and I would try to keep up with in the years ahead. I knew I was about to be promoted to major, and in every way that matters, I felt I was a very lucky man. But I also felt a strong resolve to pursue my military career, and I was hoping to play a part in building a new American Army. After the course at Leavenworth, I'd been lucky enough to have been selected for what's known as a White House Fellowship. This is a competitive program for rising young American leaders interested in public service, under which they spend a year working as special assistant to cabinet secretaries or other high-ranking members of the executive branch. It gives participants a wonderful exposure to the governmental processes from the very top, and while both Gert and I were pleased to have been selected, even at that level, there were ups and downs. When I arrived, I found I would not fill a military position, nor would I be required to perform any military duties. Instead, my actual work assignment would be as a special assistant to James T. Lynn, the director of the Office of Management and Budget. There I'd work on a wide array of programs: Social Security, food stamps, welfare, education, Medicare and Medicaid, transportation, as well as national defense issues, to which Jim Lynn might direct my efforts. The staff here were, by reputation, the highest quality in government service, and from this office virtually every government program would be visible. "I want all White House fellows out. Leave the room." It was an impersonal announcement, and I looked around the cabinet room. I was seated against the wall, waiting for President Gerald R. Ford to come in, and so far as I could tell, I was the only White House fellow among the dozen or so backbenchers. I got up and walked out. This was Don Rumsfeld's White House decorum. With Rumsfeld as White House Chief of Staff and Dick Cheney as his deputy, the White House could be a rough place. Secret memos, winks, nods, and a conspiratorial air seemed to perpetuate all the worst reported tendencies of the Nixon White House. As one senior staffer told me, "Wes, the West Wing of the White House is the only place in the world where, if you're about to fall on your face, everyone around you would back up and give you room so you'd hit very hard." You wouldn't have known it from that meeting, but I'd been given a privileged place there. Only a few weeks after I'd started the fellowship, I'd been given the opportunity to move next door for 6 weeks and work as a special assistant to former Virginia Congressman Jack O. Marsh, counselor to the president. He was running the administration group that backstopped the Senate and House committees as they ripped the intelligence community apart, and I was recruited to help him work the group as the executive secretary of the Interagency Committee. The committee would include Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, James F. Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense, William Colby, Director of Central Intelligence, William Levy, Attorney General, Philip Buchan, Counsel to the President. Jack Marsh would chair, Brent Scowcroft, Kissinger's deputy at the National Security Council, and Bill Hyland, another Kissinger deputy, were also involved. I was thrilled, for to work around these experienced and able leaders was like a dream come true. The group would respond to the congressional queries, deciding what information could be withheld, who could testify, and what they'd say. It would meet in the White House Situation Room, and I'd be seated along the wall next to Mr. Marsh, taking notes and doing follow-up for him. So I thought I was finally going to get into the national security policy world. The day I reported into the West Wing, Jack handed me a stack of yellow phone slips. "Tell me whose calls I should return and in which priority," he said. "I'll be back soon. Oh, and let me introduce you to Mike Raoul Duvall. He was on the advance team in '72, and he'll be joining you as executive secretary." Then they walked off to have lunch, leaving me with dozens of phone messages. "Jim called, urgent, called Tom on the Hill," and so on. I had no idea who the people were or what the issues were. That was the beginning. 2 nights later, I was at a White House Fellows reception when from across the room our host said, "Wes Clark, the White House is calling for you." Everyone froze. Conversation ceased. 3 months ago, we'd been applicants. 3 weeks ago, we joined our agencies. Suddenly, I was so essential to the nation that the White House would call me on a Friday night. I moved to the phone. It was the operator with Mr. Marsh on. "Wes, yesterday I gave you a special document and asked that you hold it for me and get it back to me. I don't have it back. Do you still have it?" So, it wasn't an attack on the United States or a riot or anything. Well, yes, I had it, and it was locked in the safe in the office. I should have asked when he needed it back and returned it. So I also learned that being on the inside isn't always glamorous, and sometimes it's better not to have your name singled out. Once more, I was learning competence, attention to detail, following before you lead. I left the reception to find the document and take it over to Mr. Marsh.